On Monday morning, I was handed a file I never touched. By Wednesday afternoon, Human Resources reviewed my forged signature and said, "This is not a priority right now." The next week, 3 investigators in dark jackets entered headquarters, demanding server backups and payout records for a priority contractor group. That was when I realized you do not need to speak louder to be heard. You just drop the truth into the right room where they cannot look away. My name is Mackenzie Murphy. I am 34 years old, and I make my living looking for the quiet, hidden lies that people bury inside spreadsheets. I work as a vendor compliance coordinator at Iron Vale Recovery Partners, a corporate entity housed within a towering monolith of tinted glass and brushed steel in the heart of Charlotte, North Carolina. We are a claims processing firm specializing in post-hurricane home repairs. When nature tears a coastal town apart, the insurance money flows down a highly regulated pipeline, and Iron Vale acts as the valve. We manage the vast network of contractors who arrive with their trucks and drywall to rebuild what the wind destroyed. My desk sits at the very end of that pipeline. My job is the final barrier. Before our financial department releases a single dollar of funding to a contractor, their file must pass through my screen. It is a position of invisible power, governed entirely by the unforgiving laws of documentation. Every day, I check contractor invoices against initial estimates. I scour high-resolution field photographs, looking closely at the grain of the wood and the color of the insulation to ensure the damage claimed matches the repair work billed. I verify local county building permits, checking the dates and the municipal stamps. I calculate response times down to the minute, and I authenticate the final confirmation signatures from the homeowners. I am not a beloved figure in the office. I am not known for being loud in the break room, nor am I celebrated for having a charismatic personality that commands a room. I am known, instead, for being painfully, ruthlessly accurate. If a roofing contractor submits a duplicate invoice number from a job they completed 8 months prior, I will catch it. If a vendor enters a wrong county code for a structural permit, I will flag the entire submission. If a decimal point is placed one spot to the right on a materials estimate, I will reject the file and send it all the way back to the beginning of the queue. I simply do not miss things. In an industry where tens of millions of dollars move through digital channels every single week, my paranoia is a corporate asset. I prefer my life exactly this way. I live alone in a quiet, heavily insulated apartment on the outskirts of the city. I arrive at the office at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, and I shut down my computer at exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. I have zero interest in the intricate, exhausting theater of office politics. I do not attend the heavily encouraged happy hours. I do not engage in the aggressive networking disguised as casual lunch outings. And I firmly refuse to become the center of any interpersonal drama. I am a machine built for compliance. I want to do my job, collect my paycheck, and be left entirely in peace. For a long time, Iron Vale allowed me to operate in this manner. My old team functioned under a director who valued caution over momentum. We were a slow-moving department, but we were undeniably clean. Every single claim file was subjected to 3 distinct steps of verification: the initial review, the secondary audit, and my final compliance check. Everything possessed a clear, traceable digital footprint. There were no shortcuts, no exceptions, and most importantly, no one was ever pressured to blindly approve a file just to meet an arbitrary daily quota. We were the gatekeepers, and management respected us for keeping the gates securely locked until the paperwork was flawless. That era ended with the arrival of the worst hurricane season the eastern seaboard had seen in 20 years. 3 massive, devastating storms made landfall in the span of just 2 months. The volume of incoming claims did not just increase, it violently multiplied. The digital cues on our dual monitors turned a glaring, warning red, signaling thousands upon thousands of backlogged files. Simultaneously, a new, frantic energy infected the corporate hierarchy. Whispers began to circulate through the carpeted hallways and over encrypted instant messaging channels. A massive equity firm was allegedly looking to buy Iron Veil Recovery Partners. Suddenly, the corporate vocabulary shifted overnight. Executive memos stopped mentioning accuracy, thoroughness, and compliance. Instead, every email and every meeting was dominated by words like accelerating, optimizing, and shortening processing times. The executives needed the ledger to look incredibly appealing. They needed the backlog cleared out immediately to prove to the prospective buyers that Iron Veil was a highly efficient, high-speed, profit-generating machine. The pressure descended upon us like a heavy, suffocating blanket. It was within this tense, oxygen-deprived atmosphere that our new manager arrived. His name was Derek Holston. He was 39 years old, and he looked exactly like a man who was brought in to clean house. He was meticulously groomed, with perfectly styled hair and an endless rotation of expensive, dark, tailored suits. From the very first moment he walked into our open-plan office space, the air pressure in the room seemed to drop. Derek possessed a smooth, frictionless way of speaking that made everything he said sound like a carefully focus-grouped sales pitch. He used his hands when he talked, framing his ideas in the air, projecting an aura of absolute, unearned confidence. But it was his eyes that unsettled me the most. Whenever Derek looked at his subordinates, he did not seem to be seeing human beings with lives, mortgages, and specific skill sets. He had a cold, calculating gaze. He looked at people as if he were actively appraising them, assigning them a definitive monetary value in his head. You could almost see the gears turning behind his stare, calculating whether you were an asset that could be utilized to advance his career or a liability that needed to be swiftly managed out of the department. I realized I was going to be a problem for him during our very first departmental meeting. Derek stood at the front of the main conference room, leaning casually against the polished oak table. He did not bring any notes. He spent 45 minutes talking about restructuring our workflow and embracing a new culture of aggressive velocity. He paced the room, making intense eye contact with everyone. "We have to stop letting perfection become the enemy of progress," he announced, his voice smooth and commanding. "If a file is 90% there, we push it through. Speed is our new currency, and I expect everyone in this room to start spending it." I sat quietly near the back of the room, observing him. It was then that I noticed his smile. I instantly disliked it. I did not dislike his smile because it looked particularly evil or malicious. I disliked it because it was entirely, perfectly rehearsed. It was a mechanical action. The smile never quite reached his cold eyes, and it only ever appeared on his face when he needed to disarm a question or project an illusion of corporate empathy. It was a tool, deployed with tactical precision, and it vanished the second he turned his back to the room. Watching him pack up his expensive leather briefcase after the meeting, a cold realization settled in my stomach. Derek Holston did not care about 3 steps of verification. He did not care about missing county permits, altered photographs, or clean audit trails. He only cared about the volume of files moved from the pending column to the approved column. He was a man who viewed strict regulations as mere suggestions, obstacles to be navigated around rather than rules to be followed. In a business where strict compliance is the only thing standing between legitimate disaster recovery and massive corporate fraud, a manager who wants to optimize away the rules is not just an annoyance, he is a profound danger. And as I walked back to my desk to begin reviewing the next batch of invoices, I knew with absolute certainty that his desire for speed and my obsession with the truth were going to violently collide. The transformation of our department did not happen slowly. It hit us like a localized earthquake the very next Monday. Derek called an all-hands stand-up meeting before the break room coffee machines even had a chance to warm up. He stood in the center of the room, his suit jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up exactly halfway to his elbows. He looked entirely energized by the sheer volume of stress radiating from the rest of us. He pointed a dry erase marker at the master whiteboard, drawing a sharp, downward-sloping line that cut across the grid. "This is our new operational model," Derek declared, his voice easily cutting through the morning fatigue of 30 employees. "We are no longer just processing insurance claims. We are accelerating recovery, faster approvals, faster disbursements. I want our entire backlog cut in half in exactly 90 days. A collective, uneasy shift rippled through the standing crowd. Cutting the pending queue by 50% in 3 months was not just ambitious. Mathematically, under our current regulatory guidelines, it was bordering on fiction, but Derek had already anticipated the hesitation. He clicked his marker shut, tossed it onto the tray, and introduced his solution. He called it the Priority Fast Track. It was a newly designed workflow protocol, completely separated from our standard queue. According to Derek, corporate had identified a select group of high-volume, reliable contractors who possessed a proven track record of excellence. Because these vendors were supposedly pre-vetted, their claim files no longer required the grueling, granular scrutiny my team was trained to apply. They were to be pushed straight to the front of the digital line. The mandatory site audits waived, the secondary cross-reference checks with local municipal databases deemed redundant. We need to start trusting our strategic partners, Derek told us, flashing that perfectly hollow, practiced smile I had come to despise. We cannot hold up millions of dollars in community rebuilding funds simply because we are afraid of our own shadows. Trust the process, and let the money flow. He called it trust. I looked at the new workflow chart projected on the screen and saw a massive, gaping loophole painted a very bright, very corporate shade of green. By Wednesday of that week, the first wave of priority fast-track files flooded my digital inbox. On the surface, if you were a mid-level manager looking at the macro-level dashboard, everything appeared flawless. The electronic files were neatly compiled, the digital signatures were in place, and the requested payout amounts aligned perfectly with the initial catastrophic damage estimates. They were engineered to glide through the system without friction. But I do not look at dashboards. I look at the pixels. I opened a claim for a severe roof and structural collapse in a residential neighborhood down in Wilmington. The attached field photographs showed massive water damage, splintered wooden rafters, and a very distinct jagged water stain shaped roughly like an anvil spreading across a torn piece of interior drywall. I approved the initial compliance check, though a faint, nagging sensation tugged at the back of my mind. 2 days later, I was processing a completely different priority fast-track file. This one was for a contractor operating out of Colombia, nearly 200 miles away from the first site. As I scrolled through the required evidentiary field photos, my hand froze on the computer mouse. There it was. The splintered wooden rafter, the anvil-shaped water stain on the drywall, the lighting, the angle, the debris scattered on the floorboard. It was an exact replica. I opened the Wilmington file on my left monitor and the Columbia file on my right. I zoomed in until the digital grain broke apart. They were not just similar. They were the exact same photographs, seamlessly recycled and submitted under 2 entirely different property addresses, attached to 2 entirely different claims, demanding 2 entirely different massive financial payouts. My pulse quickened, a cold spike of adrenaline hitting my system. I immediately dug into the text documents. If they were recycling photos, they were likely cutting corners elsewhere. I pulled up the primary contractor invoices for both the Wilmington and the Columbia claims. Despite representing completely different construction firms with different letterheads and corporate addresses, the invoices shared an unnatural DNA. The itemized breakdown of materials was structured identically. More damningly, halfway down the page under the interior materials column, both invoices contained the exact same glaring typographical error. They both requested thousands of dollars for premium insulation, spelling the word with a double L. Furthermore, the date format on both documents was highly irregular. Instead of standard American dating, both vendors typed out the dates in an obscure military format, placing the day first, spelling out the month entirely, and leaving off the year entirely. It was a fingerprint. These were not 2 separate vendors working on 2 separate houses. They were 2 hands attached to the exact same corporate ghost. I gathered the printed comparisons, secured them in a heavy manila folder, and walked straight into Derek's glass-walled office. I did not knock. I placed the open folder directly on his pristine desk. tapping my index finger on the matching anvil-shaped water stains. "We have a massive problem," I said, keeping my voice low and completely steady. "These two vendors are on your priority fast-track list. They are claiming jobs 200 miles apart, but they are submitting the exact same field photos. They are also using identical billing templates with the exact same spelling errors. This is not a coincidence. This is structural fraud." Derek did not jolt. He did not look surprised, nor did he lean in to examine the glaring evidence I had just placed in front of him. Instead, he leaned back in his expensive ergonomic chair, steepled his fingers, and sighed loudly, acting as if I were a toddler interrupting a vital phone call. "Mackenzie," he said smoothly, using that condescending tone that made my jaw tighten. "Take a breath. You are looking at shadows and calling them monsters. I am looking at duplicate invoices and falsified photographic evidence," I countered sharply, refusing to break eye contact. "If I push these through, we are authorizing payments for ghost repairs." Derek picked up a heavy silver pen and tapped it thoughtfully against his leather desk pad. "What you are looking at is a back-office vendor template. These independent contractors often use the same third-party administrative services to generate their paperwork and manage their digital intake. The admin service probably attached the wrong stock photo as a placeholder, and the spelling error is just a shared macro in their software. It is sloppy on their part, yes, but it is not a conspiracy." "A placeholder photo for a multi-$1,000 structural repair claim?" I asked, my tone hardening with disbelief. "That violates every single compliance mandate we have on the books. I am flagging both of these accounts and freezing their pending disbursements until we conduct a physical field verification." Derek stood up. The practiced smile was completely gone, replaced by a cold, flat expression that finally matched the dead look in his eyes. He leaned over the desk, intentionally invading my space. "You are not freezing anything," Derek commanded quietly. "You are going to go back to your desk, and you are going to process those files. I will send an email to the vendor reminding them to be more careful with their administrative attachments, but I need you to listen to me very carefully. Mackenzie, you need to stop hindering speed with this archaic perfectionism. We have financial targets to hit. Do not become a bottleneck." He slid the manila folder back across the desk toward me. It felt like a physical dismissal, a heavy door slamming shut in my face. I took the folder and walked back to my desk. I did not freeze the accounts. The system would not allow me to override a direct managerial directive without triggering an immediate insubordination review, but I did not delete my findings, either. I created a hidden, encrypted folder on my local drive and quietly dropped the duplicate files inside, locking them away. By the end of the first month, the operational dashboard mounted on the wall of our department was glowing with vibrant, victorious green graphics. Derek had achieved what the executive board thought was impossible. His face was plastered on the company intranet homepage. The department metrics showed our overall processing time had decreased by a staggering 42%. The volume of total disbursement revenue had skyrocketed, pushing massive amounts of capital out the door faster than ever before. In the hushed, carpeted corridors of the executive suites, upper management was already anointing him the brilliant new rising star of the operations division. Everyone was celebrating the velocity. Everyone was clapping for the sheer volume of money moving through the pipeline. But as I sat in the dimming light of my cubicle late on a Friday evening, watching the congratulatory emails flood my inbox, I felt a heavy, terrifying dread settle deep in my chest. I stared at the perfect green numbers on the screen. I knew the truth about those statistics. The most beautiful, flawless numbers usually appear exactly when something incredibly dark is being buried deep underground, right beneath everyone's feet. The hum of the fluorescent lights above my cubicle always felt a little heavier on a Monday morning. It was exactly 8 o'clock when I logged into the secure corporate portal, my black coffee cooling rapidly in a ceramic mug beside my keyboard. The weekend had been blissfully quiet, providing a necessary temporary barrier between my mind and the relentless digital queue of disaster claims. I pulled up my personal compliance dashboard, fully expecting to see the standard backlog of pending cases assigned to my identification number. Instead, the screen displayed a glaring, impossible anomaly. 3 separate, massive payout files had been fully authorized, cleared for final financial disbursement. The approving digital signature permanently stamped on all 3 files was mine. The system time code for the final authorization was recorded at exactly 11:45 at night on Sunday. A cold, heavy knot formed at the base of my throat. I stared at the glowing green authorization stamps, my mind frantically rewinding the events of the previous 12 hours. I knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that I had not touched a company server on Sunday night. At exactly 10 o'clock, I had turned off the cellular data on my mobile phone and placed it face down on my kitchen counter. I had spent the remainder of the evening wrapped in a heavy blanket, watching a black and white film from the 1950s. I had been asleep by 11:15. I was nowhere near the corporate network when my secure credentials supposedly clicked the final approval button on hundreds of thousands of dollars in disaster relief funds. My fingers moved over the keyboard with mechanical, almost robotic precision. I opened the first authorized file, then the second, then the third. My stomach dropped completely. All 3 claims were branded with the bright green priority fast-track designation. More horrifyingly, they all belonged to the exact same cluster of contractors I had explicitly warned management about just a few weeks prior. The Wilmington property, the Columbia property, the ghost vendors with their identical typographical errors, bizarre date formats, and recycled field photographs. They had not just bypassed the standard queue, they had been actively pushed through the final gate, and the system permanently recorded that my hand had turned the key to the vault. I initiated a deep-level forensic trace on the 3 claim histories. In our previous operating system, every single keystroke left a permanent digital shadow. I scrolled down to the foundational workflow logs, looking for the chain of custody. It had been surgically altered. The mandatory hold flag I had manually placed for pending license verification was completely gone. The system did not show it as resolved by a supervisor. It showed it as if it had never existed in the first place. I checked the internal communication notes attached to the Columbia file. The lengthy paragraph I had typed detailing the duplicated anvil-shaped water stains had been wiped entirely clean. In its place was a generic, auto-generated system stamp indicating a clear visual review. Someone had not just stolen my digital identity to approve the funds. They had meticulously scrubbed the digital crime scene of my previous warnings. I did not gather a manila folder this time. I did not print out physical proof to lay on a desk. The anger I felt was no longer hot and immediate. It was freezing cold and highly concentrated. I stood up, walked straight down the central aisle of the department, and stepped into Derek Holston's office. I closed the heavy glass door firmly behind me, ensuring the latch clicked shut to block out the ambient noise of the floor. Derek looked up from his dual monitors, his expression a mask of mild, polite inquiry. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, his posture completely relaxed, projecting the aura of a man who had absolutely nothing to hide. "Good morning, Mackenzie," he said smoothly. "Is there something you need before the daily stand-up meeting?" "Someone used my login credentials at 1:45 last night," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "They bypassed the security protocols, deleted my internal audit notes, and approved 3 massive priority fast-track claims using my digital signature. Claims that I specifically told you were fraudulent." I waited for the shock. I waited for the defensive anger, the immediate denial, or even the performative outrage of a manager discovering a severe security breach within his ranks. I received none of those things. Derek leaned back in his expensive leather chair, resting his hands casually on his lap. He did not break eye contact. Slowly, the corners of his mouth turned up into that perfectly hollow, rehearsed smile. It was the smile of a man who was holding all the winning cards and wanted to make sure I knew it. "Mackenzie," he said, his tone dripping with thick, fake concern. "You have been under a tremendous amount of stress lately." "We all have. This new volume is demanding a lot from everyone on the floor. Are you absolutely certain you did not log in from home to try and get ahead of the Monday rush? It is very easy to forget you helped process a few files after hours when you are exhausted and trying to be a team player. I stared at him, the silence stretching tight and dangerous between us. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He was not just gaslighting me to my face. He was laying out the exact narrative he would use if I tried to escalate the issue to human resources or the technology department. If I demanded an internet protocol address trace, he would simply claim I was an overworked, confused employee who forgot my own actions under the pressure of the new operational model. It was a brilliantly constructed trap. It was my word, the word of a notoriously rigid compliance coordinator, against the word of the department's new, highly profitable golden boy. If I reacted with explosive anger, I would look unhinged. If I screamed about a corporate conspiracy, I would look desperate and paranoid. "I do not work on Sundays," I replied, keeping every syllable measured and flat. "And I do not forget my own approvals." "Well," Derek said, turning his attention back to his monitor, dismissing my presence entirely. "The files are cleared. The vendors are getting paid. I suggest we focus on the queue in front of us today, rather than phantom memories of last night." I turned around and walked out of the glass box. I sat back down at my desk, my hands shaking slightly with a potent mixture of rage and raw adrenaline. I knew I had to be incredibly careful. Every move I made from this second forward was going to be scrutinized. I was swimming in dark water, and I had just located the shark. At exactly 2 o'clock that afternoon, a notification popped up in my inbox. It was a department-wide email from Derek, sent to all 30 employees on our floor and strategically carbon copied to the upper-level executive directors in the operational division. The subject line read, "Acknowledging outstanding weekend dedication." I clicked the email open. The text was brightly formatted and full of aggressive corporate buzzwords. "I want to take a moment to publicly recognize Mackenzie Murphy." The email read, "As we push toward our 90-day turnaround goals, Mackenzie has proven to be our most flexible team member during this critical sprint. Her willingness to log in late on a Sunday night to push through vital priority fast-track files shows a true dedication to our new velocity model. Please join me in thanking her for stepping outside her comfort zone and helping us clear the backlog." I read the carefully crafted words 3 times. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver was sickening. He was publicly locking the false narrative into place before I could ever hope to dismantle it. He was giving me glowing public credit for a crime I did not commit, tying my name securely to the fraudulent approvals with a shiny corporate bow. If a state auditor or an internal investigator ever came looking months down the line, Derek would just point to this cheerful email as definitive proof that I was the one eagerly processing the dirty files late at night. I closed the email application. The reality of the situation finally settled over me, heavy and suffocating. This was no longer a professional disagreement over workflow optimization. This was not a clash of personalities or a philosophical debate about operational speed. Derek Holston was building a corrupt, money-laundering machine right inside the walls of Iron Vale, and he was using me as the protective firewall. He was deliberately taking my clean, spotless professional record and pressing my fingerprints deep into his fraudulent work. If the machine ever broke, if the executives ever found the missing money or the fake photographs, I was the one who was going to take the ultimate fall. I looked around the open office. People were typing, drinking coffee, and chatting casually about their weekends, completely unaware of the poison seeping into the floorboards beneath their desks. I took a deep breath, opened a blank digital notepad on my secondary screen, and began to type out the exact time, date, and network configuration of my home router. I was not going to let them bury me. I was going to let them think they had won, right up until the moment I burned their entire system to the ground. I stopped arguing with the void. Arguing only gives your opponent a map of your strategy. Instead, I began to build a vault. Every morning, the very first thing I did was download my login session history from the central server. I captured screenshots of my active terminal times, ensuring my exact location and digital presence were permanently recorded. I pulled the security logs for my physical building badge, creating an unbroken timeline of exactly when I entered the glass doors and exactly when I walked out to the parking garage. Whenever a new priority fast-track file hit my queue, I immediately exported the raw, unedited invoice into a secure, encrypted folder hidden deep within my local drive. Hours later, when those same files mysteriously bypassed my queue and received their final approval, I downloaded the altered versions. I placed the before and after documents side by side. I was no longer just an employee doing her job. I was a digital archivist building an airtight museum of corporate fraud. Derek responded to my silent defiance not with shouting, but with the cold, calculated precision of modern corporate warfare. He never raised his voice. He never insulted me directly. That kind of behavior leaves a messy, actionable trail. Instead, he deployed the velvet hammer of performance management. He began to systematically paint me into a corner using human resources terminology. In team emails, he would casually refer to me as a bottleneck. He attached labels to my professional profile like rigid, difficult to collaborate with, and completely unsuited for our new culture of speed. The isolation was swift and brutally effective. Suddenly, my calendar invitations for key vendor alignment meetings simply vanished. I was excluded from the strategic planning sessions I used to lead. Then came the weaponized deadlines. At exactly 4:45 in the afternoon, Derek would drop a highly complex batch of 40 files onto my digital desk, demanding a comprehensive review by the close of business at 5 o'clock. It was a mathematical impossibility. When I inevitably left the files pending overnight, he would arrive at my cubicle the next morning, shaking his head with an expression of deep manufactured disappointment. He would ask me, loudly enough for the entire row to hear, why I was struggling so much with the concept of task ownership. He was carefully, methodically building a documented paper trail of failure. He was constructing the narrative required to fire me for cause. The psychological weight of workplace isolation is heavy. My colleagues began to give my desk a wide berth. They could see the crosshairs painted squarely on my back, and no one wanted to be caught in the collateral damage. But fear does not silence everyone entirely. Late one afternoon, I was standing in the break room, waiting for the coffee machine to finish its grinding cycle. Naomi Sutter, a senior coordinator who sat 2 rows over and had been with the company for 5 years, walked in. She did not make eye contact. She stood next to me, pouring sugar into her paper cup. "Derek never leaves the building at 5 o'clock, Naomi murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes fixed entirely on her stirring spoon. "He stays here until 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Him and Tessa, his coordination assistant, they wait until the floor is empty, and then they lock the glass door to his office. He tells the night shift security guard they are just fixing the pipeline before the executive operational reports go out the next morning. You need to be extremely careful." Things are happening in the dark. Before I could ask her a single question, she threw her stirrer in the trash and walked quickly out of the room. The second piece of the puzzle arrived purely by accident 2 days later. My secondary monitor was flickering, so I called the internal technology help desk. The technician on the line was a young guy who sounded deeply exhausted. He accessed my terminal remotely and resolved the display glitch in a matter of minutes. Right before he disconnected the call, he let out a loud, frustrated sigh. "You compliance people really need to get your security protocols together," he complained over the headset. "I have processed at least a dozen 2-factor authentication reset tickets for your department in the past 3 weeks. My team is going crazy handling these late-night lockouts." I froze, my hand gripping the phone receiver tightly. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. "Who exactly is requesting these security resets?" There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I heard him swallow hard. The realization of what he had just casually revealed to someone outside his department clearly hit him. "Never mind," he mumbled quickly, his voice tight with sudden panic. "Forget I said anything. Have a good day." The line went dead. The entire scheme suddenly snapped into blinding focus. The late nights in the locked office. The reset tickets. Derek and his assistant were not just working late, they were intentionally bypassing our security hardware. They were calling the help desk after hours, claiming we had lost our phones or locked ourselves out, requesting temporary bypass codes for our accounts. They were hijacking our digital identities to push the fraudulent files through the final gates, leaving our names stamped on the absolute worst of the corruption. Armed with this understanding, I stopped looking at the recycled photographs and the missing permits. I dove straight into the financial bedrock of the files. I pulled the master disbursement ledger for the entire priority fast-track group. I ignored the names of the contracting companies. I ignored the various mailing addresses scattered across a dozen different coastal cities. I looked exclusively at the banking routing numbers and the final deposit account destinations. I spent 4 solid hours cross-referencing 25 different vendors. The result was terrifying. Despite claiming to be completely independent businesses operating from vastly different geographical locations, every single dollar of their approved claims was flowing directly into exactly 2 local regional bank branches. The exact same 2 financial institutions were swallowing millions of dollars in disaster relief funds. This was not just a case of a manager rushing sloppy paperwork to secure a quarterly bonus. This was an organized, massive extraction of corporate capital. They were utilizing the sheer chaos of a catastrophic hurricane season to siphon a river of cash into a tightly controlled, backyard network of ghost contractors. The inevitable confrontation arrived on a Thursday. A new claim landed on my primary monitor. It was a demand for $75,000 to cover a complete structural foundation rebuild in a heavily flooded coastal zone. I scrolled down to the mandatory documentation section. The field for the required county structural permit was completely blank. There was no stamp, no signature, no proof the local government even knew a house was being rebuilt. I did not hesitate. I hit the bright red rejection button, instantly freezing the $75,000 payment. Less than 10 minutes later, Derek appeared at the edge of my cubicle. He did not look angry. He looked completely serene. He leaned heavily against the gray fabric partition of my desk. Crossing his arms over his expensive tailored suit jacket, he looked down at me, blocking out the overhead fluorescent light. "You just rejected the coastal foundation rebuild," he stated quietly. "The file is completely missing the county permit," I replied, keeping my eyes locked on the blank wall behind my monitor. "I cannot authorize a structural payout of $75,000 without definitive proof that the local municipality approved the engineering blueprints." Derek leaned in closer. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering, clinging to the air like a physical weight. He dropped his voice to a level so low, so intimately menacing, that no one in the surrounding cubicles could possibly hear him. "You can be the protector of the process," Derek said smoothly, every word perfectly measured and completely devoid of warmth. "Or you can be left behind by the process. It is entirely your choice. But the train is leaving the station. Mackenzie, I highly suggest you figure out how to get on board." He stood up straight, adjusted his cuffs, and walked away. He thought he had given me an ultimatum. He thought he had presented me with a choice between my morals and my paycheck. He did not realize he had just given me the final piece of motivation I needed to destroy his entire world. I decided to follow the rules. That is the fundamental trap they set for people like me. They build a corporate grievance matrix, print it in a glossy employee handbook, and convince you that the system is designed to protect you. I logged into the internal scheduling portal and booked a 45-minute block on the calendar of Lila Voss. Lila was the Director of Human Resources for Iron Vale. Her office was located on the top floor of the building, a pristine, aggressively quiet space separated from the chaotic operational floors by thick glass and keycard-restricted elevators. Walking into her office felt like stepping into a vacuum. The carpet was thick and soundproof. The walls were painted in soothing, neutral tones. Lila herself was a masterpiece of corporate polish. She possessed a perfectly tailored wardrobe and a calm, measured voice. She spoke as though every single syllable she uttered had been preemptively reviewed by a team of defense attorneys. She was polite, professional, and entirely impenetrable. During our first meeting, I sat across from her massive, perfectly organized mahogany desk. I was strategic. I was careful. I explicitly decided not to use the word fraud. I knew that word carried legal weight, and I did not want to trigger an immediate defensive lockdown. Instead, I framed the situation as a severe systemic failure and a breakdown in managerial protocol. I explained that my secure digital authorization stamp was actively appearing on disaster relief claim files that I had never opened, reviewed, or processed. I also mentioned, maintaining a completely neutral tone, that my direct supervisor was applying aggressive daily pressure on my department to completely bypass mandatory compliance checkpoints. Lila was the picture of active listening. She leaned forward slightly. She maintained perfect, empathetic eye contact. She took meticulous notes with a heavy silver fountain pen on a fresh legal pad. She nodded at exactly the right moments, projecting an aura of deep concern. "Mackenzie," Lila said smoothly, her voice a soothing hum, "I hear what you're saying, and I understand why this feels incredibly stressful. It sounds to me like you are experiencing a severe operational conflict. Rapid scaling, like what our division is going through right now, often creates massive friction between the compliance and operations teams. This seems like a communication gap regarding the new workflow expectations. I think this is something we should address directly with the division manager first, to ensure everyone is aligned on the new priorities." I left her office feeling a false sense of relief. I assumed the machinery of human resources was finally turning. I returned to my desk and waited. I waited for the formal incident report to be generated. I waited for an automated email assigning me a case reference number. I waited for a calendar invitation for a mediated sit-down with the division manager. Nothing came. 24 hours passed, then 48 hours, then a full week. There was no email. There was no follow-up. There was absolutely no digital trace that our meeting had ever occurred. All I had received was a highly civilized smile and a vague, unrecorded promise that she would monitor the situation. Exactly 1 week later, I returned to the top floor. This time, I did not come empty-handed. I brought the vault I had been building. I carried a thick, neatly organized binder and placed it directly onto the center of her mahogany desk. I did not wait for her to ask questions. I opened the binder and began laying out the physical proof. "These are my building access logs," I said, pointing to the first set of highlighted documents. "They prove definitively that I was not inside this building or logged into the corporate network remotely when my terminal approved over $500,000 in claims last Sunday night." I flipped the page. These are the side-by-side photographic comparisons of the contractor invoices. They show identical field photographs being submitted for entirely different properties located hundreds of miles apart. And here is the vendor list, highlighting a bizarre, repeating pattern of typographical errors across supposedly independent contracting firms. Lila did not lean forward this time. She did not pick up her silver fountain pen. The empathetic, professional warmth vanished from her face, replaced by a tight, rigid mask. She barely glanced at the extensive evidence I had laid out before her. Instead, she looked up at me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Mackenzie," Lila asked, her tone suddenly sharp and accusatory, "why are you diving so deeply into matters that fall entirely outside the scope of your specific role? Your job description is very clear. You are a coordinator. Your responsibility is to review the files actively placed in your personal queue, not to act as an internal auditor investigating the entire departmental pipeline." I stared at her, stunned by the immediate reversal. She was weaponizing my own job description against me. She was actively framing my attempt to report a massive security breach as a rogue, insubordinate violation of company policy. "My digital signature is being attached to these files without my consent," I replied, forcing my voice to remain perfectly steady despite the rising panic in my chest. "I am deeply concerned that I am being positioned as the scapegoat. If external auditors ever review this quarter, my name is the only one tied to these approvals." Lila sighed heavily, intertwining her fingers and resting them on her desk pad. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and severe annoyance. "Iron Veil is in a highly sensitive phase right now," she stated. using the exact corporate code words for the impending buyout that everyone knew about, but no one was allowed to officially discuss. We are currently under a microscope from very important external stakeholders. The absolute last thing we want to do is escalate a misunderstanding too early. We do not want to create unnecessary panic on the executive floor. I strongly suggest you take a breath, return to your desk, and stick strictly to your assigned lane. She closed the binder and pushed it back across the desk toward me. It was a physical dismissal. The third and final meeting happened 3 days later. I did not schedule it through the portal. I simply walked onto the executive floor, bypassed her administrative assistant, and stood in the doorway of her office. The volume of fraudulent approvals under my name had doubled overnight. I had nothing left to lose, and I was entirely done with diplomacy. Lila looked up from her computer monitor, startled and clearly displeased by the unannounced intrusion. "Mackenzie, I am in the middle of preparing for a board meeting," she said sharply. "You need to schedule time on my calendar." I stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind me. I looked her directly in the eyes. I abandoned all the polite corporate terminology. "My manager is actively manipulating the internal authorization matrix," I stated plainly, my voice ringing clear and hard in the quiet room. "Derek Holston is deliberately bypassing mandatory reviews to release wrongful financial disbursements to a targeted, fraudulent group of contractors. He is stealing from the disaster relief funds, and he is stealing my credentials to do it." For a long moment, the room was completely silent. I waited for the alarm. I waited for her to pick up the phone and call the legal department. I waited for the facade to drop. Lila Voss simply stopped typing. She slowly removed her reading glasses and placed them next to her keyboard. She looked up at me. Her face was completely devoid of shock. There was no outrage. There was no concern for the integrity of the company. There was only a cold, calculating irritation. She looked at me as if I were a speck of dirt ruining a perfectly polished floor. "Mackenzie," Lila said, her voice dropping to a low, dead calm. She delivered the exact sentence that ignited the entire war. "This is not a priority right now." I did not argue. I did not yell. I simply turned around and walked out of her office. As I rode the elevator back down to the operational floor, a terrifying clarity washed over me. Human resources was not going to save me. They were not ignorant of the fire burning in the basement. They were actively guarding the door to keep anyone from putting it out before the company could be sold. The system was never designed to protect the truth. It was designed to protect the transaction. I did not argue with Lila Voss. I did not raise my voice, and I certainly did not threaten her with legal action or a dramatic resignation. When a system explicitly tells you that your survival is not a priority, you do not ask the system for a second opinion. You simply step outside of it. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor, walked out into the humid afternoon air, and drove straight home. I locked my front door, closed the blinds, and opened my personal laptop. I was completely finished playing defense. It was time to build a trap that they could not simply sweep under a mahogany desk. I spent the next 48 hours sitting at my kitchen counter, barely pausing to eat or sleep. I transformed my laptop into a digital war room. I opened a massive, encrypted spreadsheet and began constructing a master timeline, tracking every single anomaly day by day over the past 3 months. I organized my entire collection of evidence into 4 distinct, undeniable pillars of corporate fraud. The first pillar was the forged access log. I cross-referenced the exact minute my digital signature authorized the massive payouts with the timestamps from the parking garage security gates, proving I was nowhere near the building. The second pillar contained the physical evidence. I created side-by-side comparisons of the duplicate contractor invoices, highlighting the identical spelling errors and the recycled photographs of water damage that were being submitted for properties located hundreds of miles apart. The third pillar was the financial matrix. I had tracked the routing numbers of 20 different priority fast-track vendors, proving that millions of dollars from supposedly independent companies were all funneling into exactly 2 local bank accounts. The fourth and final pillar documented the internal retaliation. I compiled every unreasonable deadline, every passive-aggressive email, and every meeting invitation Derek had rescinded, proving a coordinated effort to silence an internal auditor. I had the framework of the crime, but I needed the exact motive. I understood the how, but the sheer, reckless scale of the operation required a massive why. The missing piece of the puzzle arrived on a Saturday morning. I received a text message from Naomi Sutter, asking me to meet her at a small, independent coffee shop 3 blocks away from the corporate headquarters. When I arrived, Naomi was sitting in a corner booth, her hands wrapped tightly around a paper cup. She looked exhausted and terrified. "Derek was drinking heavily at the director's dinner last Thursday," Naomi whispered, leaning across the small table so the couple sitting next to us could not hear. "He thought he was only surrounded by upper management, but I was standing right behind him waiting for the valet. He started bragging about his new contract. He said if he gets the department backlog completely cleared and hits the target metrics before the corporate buyout is finalized, his contract guarantees him a 6-figure cash bonus." Naomi took a shaky breath and looked me directly in the eyes. "He is not just trying to look like a superstar, Mackenzie. He is trying to cash out before the new owners take over. And he does not care who he has to destroy to get that money." The entire picture suddenly snapped into terrifying, brilliant focus. This was never about accelerating disaster recovery for hurricane victims. This was a mercenary heist. Derek needed the operational ledger to look perfectly green by a very specific financial deadline, and he was using the chaos of the storms to quietly rob the vault on his way out the door. Lila Voss was likely looking at a massive retention bonus of her own, which explained why she was so desperate to bury my complaints. Armed with this absolute clarity, I knew that submitting anything else to internal human resources was corporate suicide. I needed leverage that existed far beyond the reach of Iron Veil's executive suite. I spent Sunday afternoon digging through the deepest, most heavily buried archives of the corporate intranet. I bypassed the standard employee handbook entirely and downloaded the official vendor integrity policy. Deep within the legal jargon, on page 42, I found exactly what I needed. The document contained a legally binding clause mandating that any suspicion of forged approvals, vendor kickbacks, or internal conflicts of interest must be reported directly to an independent, third-party ethics hotline. Iron Veil paid an outside firm to manage this hotline precisely to maintain the illusion of compliance. I did not stop there. I went after the true source of the money. I researched Northbridge Assurance, our largest client. They were the primary insurance carrier actually funding the multi-million-dollar hurricane relief payouts. I found their external whistleblower portal. Their compliance language was ruthless. It strictly forbade any retroactive alteration of claim files once a disaster loss had been recorded, and it threatened immediate termination of vendor contracts if any fraud was detected. I had the external targets locked in, but I needed the final, undeniable thread. I needed the smoking gun that tied Derek directly to the digital forgery of my signature. I thought about the exhausted technology support technician who had slipped up on the phone about the late-night security resets. I searched for his name on a professional networking website. I saw that his employment status had changed to looking for work just 2 days prior. He had either quit in frustration or been fired. I sent him a secure, direct message. I did not ask for a favor. I laid out the reality of the situation. "I know exactly what they are doing with the late-night approvals," I typed. "I am submitting a massive fraud package to the external compliance authorities. You can either be listed as a witness who was manipulated, or you can go down as the accomplice who handed them the keys to the vault. Send me the proof." The tension over the next 12 hours was agonizing. I sat at my kitchen counter, watching the cursor blink on my screen. Finally, at 2 o'clock in the morning, a reply appeared in my inbox. "I do not want to go to federal prison for what your manager is doing." His message read, "Here is what you asked for." Attached to the message was a high-resolution screenshot of an archived help desk ticket. It was the absolute holy grail. The ticket was a formal priority request to override the two-factor authentication on my specific user profile at 11:30 at night on that Sunday. The authorizing signature on the request did not belong to a system administrator. It belonged to Tessa Wynn, the direct personal coordination assistant to Derek Holston. I saved the image to my encrypted drive, my hands physically shaking. The puzzle was completely finished. I no longer had just a collection of vague suspicions or a standard human resources grievance about a difficult boss. I held the complete, irrefutable anatomy of a corporate crime. I had the behavioral pattern. I had the six-figure financial motive. I had the precise technological method. Most importantly, I had a documented chain of custody linking the executive office directly to the digital forgery. Derek Holston thought he had successfully neutralized me. He believed he had buried me alive under a suffocating mountain of gaslighting and corporate bureaucracy. He had no idea that while he was busy celebrating his fake metrics, I had spent the last week quietly digging a trench completely around his perfect, polished kingdom. I had crammed it full of everything I wanted gone, and at last I stood there at the edge, clutching the final note in my hand. The decision to cut off all communication with the internal human resources department was the easiest choice I made during the entire ordeal. I did not send Lila Voss another meticulously drafted email, nor did I attempt to schedule a secondary follow-up meeting on her calendar. I realized that within the polished architecture of a modern corporate entity, the Human Resources Division is never a shield meant to protect the individual employee. It functions exclusively as an early warning radar system for the executive board. If I handed them my complete, finalized vault of evidence, I would simply be providing Derek and his coordination assistant with a heavily subsidized 5-day head start. They would use that time to scrub the internal servers, permanently delete the duplicate contractor invoices, and quietly terminate the fraudulent vendor profiles before any real questions could be asked. I needed a detonation mechanism that did not report to the top floor of Iron Veil Recovery Partners. Late on a Tuesday night, surrounded by the absolute quiet of my apartment, I navigated to the Alder Klein Ethics Review digital portal. Iron Veil proudly printed the Alder Klein hotline phone number on the back of our plastic security badges. Management frequently mentioned the independent auditing firm during our mandatory annual compliance onboarding seminars, utilizing their name to project an aura of strict corporate morality. However, no one on the operational floor actually believed the system functioned. It was widely viewed as a corporate ghost box, a place where complaints went to die. But legally, because Alder Klein operated as an entirely independent third-party entity, filing a formal documented complaint through their digital system created an unbreakable, federally protected digital paper trail. The company could not simply reclassify the report and bury it in a drawer. I uploaded my first comprehensive dossier. I did not write a passionate, emotionally charged essay about workplace toxicity or unfair managerial treatment. I wrote exactly like a forensic accountant. I systematically removed every single trace of emotion, personal frustration, and office politics from my language. My report was structured strictly around cold, undeniable data points. I listed the specific calendar dates of the offenses. I spelled out the exact times, explicitly noting how the unauthorized system approvals occurred between 11 o'clock and midnight. I documented the specific monetary values involved, spelling out unauthorized financial disbursements of $45,000 and $72,000 that were pushed through the system without the mandatory county structural permits. I attached the high-resolution screenshots of the forged authorization stamps directly next to the corporate building access logs, definitively proving my physical absence from the premises. At exactly 1 o'clock in the morning, I shifted my focus to the second, much heavier target. I accessed the external fraud reporting website for Northbridge Assurance. They were the apex predators in this financial ecosystem. They were the massive, global insurance conglomerate actually supplying the hundreds of millions of dollars in hurricane relief capital. Iron Veil was merely their administrative middleman, hired to manage the paperwork. Northbridge maintained a notoriously zero-tolerance policy for manipulated damage claims. I sent their dedicated anti-fraud division a highly concentrated, heavily encrypted package. I highlighted the precise digital locations within our shared database where the post-storm repair files had been actively manipulated immediately prior to the final disbursement of funds. I provided them with the digital footprints of the altered files. At 2:30 in the morning, I compiled the third and final strike. I submitted a massive reporting package to the Carolina Contractor Integrity Office. This was the state regulatory body that governed commercial construction licenses. I provided the state investigators with a customized, cross-referenced spreadsheet. It contained a direct side-by-side comparison of the missing local municipal permits and the deeply concerning financial routing patterns. I detailed exactly how supposedly independent contracting companies, boasting wildly different mailing addresses across the coastal region, were all actively funneling their approved federal and state relief funds into the exact same two local bank branches. When I finally clicked the last digital submission button, the green clock on my kitchen stove read 3:15. I slowly closed my laptop monitor. The room was perfectly silent. The heavy, suffocating weight of anxiety that had been sitting squarely on my chest for over a month was entirely gone. It was replaced by a strange, icy calm. The trap was set. The doors were locked from the outside. 4 hours later, I walked into the Iron Vale headquarters. I swiped my security badge at exactly 7:55 in the morning. I sat down at my desk, logged into my secure terminal, and began my day exactly as I had done every single day for the past 3 years. I opened the standard digital queue. I reviewed the legitimate invoices for drywall and roofing materials. I checked the photographic evidence submitted by the regular, honest contractors. I drank my black coffee and listened to the ambient noise of the office. When Derek sent me an urgent email demanding a status update on a specific, non-priority file, I did not ignore him. I replied within 7 minutes. My written tone was impeccably polite, entirely professional, and completely devoid of any underlying friction. I used compliant phrases like, "I will address this immediately," and "thank you for the operational clarification." I seamlessly transformed into the perfect, obedient drone he had been relentlessly trying to force me to become. He immediately noticed the behavioral shift. He interpreted my sudden lack of resistance as a total psychological surrender. He genuinely thought the heavy-handed human resources meetings, the isolation tactics, and the constant, looming threat of termination had finally broken my spirit. In his mind, the difficult, stubborn compliance coordinator had finally learned her proper place in the corporate hierarchy. He thought I had finally closed my eyes to the numbers. His arrogance rapidly swelled to fill the empty space my silence left behind. During our Friday morning departmental stand-up meeting, Derek was practically radiating energy. He wore a brand-new, custom-tailored charcoal gray suit. He stood at the front of the crowded room, beaming with an aggressive, infectious confidence, and pointed a laser pointer at the operational dashboard projecting brightly on the white wall. The priority, fast-track metrics were completely off the charts, glowing in a vibrant, victorious green. "Look at this velocity," Derek announced to the room, his voice loud and booming over the hum of the air conditioning. "We are moving capital faster than any other division in this entire company, because we finally stopped letting outdated, archaic procedures hold us hostage. We are on track to completely clear the entire claim backlog by the end of the second quarter. We are going to be operating at a zero backlog. That is unprecedented in this industry." A few people in the room clapped enthusiastically. Others simply stared at their shoes, deeply exhausted by the relentless daily push for maximum speed. I stood near the back of the room, holding my ceramic coffee mug with both hands, my facial expression completely neutral and unreadable. "Mackenzie," Derek called out suddenly, his eyes finding me easily in the crowd. He offered me that hollow, perfectly practiced smile. "I want to personally thank you for finally aligning with the new departmental vision. Your recent turnaround in processing speed has been a fantastic addition to the overall team effort." "You are very welcome," I replied evenly, ensuring my voice remained steady and completely flat. "I am just following the established protocols." He nodded, deeply satisfied with my public submission, and turned back to the projection screen to continue his energetic victory speech, He truly believed he had won the war. He believed the millions of dollars currently flowing into those two specific local bank accounts were completely untraceable. He firmly believed his upcoming six-figure executive performance bonus was securely locked inside the corporate vault. He thought my sudden silence meant I had finally given up the fight. He did not understand the basic mechanics of an ambush. My silence was not an act of submission. It was the deliberate, breathless pause of someone who had already pulled the pin out of the grenade. I was just standing there quietly, watching him smile, patiently waiting for the heavy metal lever to hit the floor. The fallout did not arrive quietly, nor did it give anyone the courtesy of a warning. It hit the building on a Thursday morning, right in the middle of the heavy conditioned air of the operational floor. At exactly 8:45, the standard departmental progress meeting was abruptly canceled. The overhead speakers, usually reserved for generic administrative announcements, crackled to life. The receptionist from the main lobby was paging the executive suite, and her voice was uncharacteristically tight, stripped of its usual cheerful customer service tone. 5 people had just walked through the revolving glass doors on the ground floor. 3 of them were senior investigators from Alder Klein, the Independent Ethics Review Board. The other 2 were senior legal representatives directly from Northbridge Assurance, our massive corporate client. They were dressed in sharp, dark blue jackets, carrying heavy, secure metal briefcases. They did not wait in the reception area for visitor badges. They did not accept the offer of coffee or water. They bypassed the standard security protocols, stepped into the executive elevator, and rode straight up to the top floor. They did not come to negotiate. They did not come to listen to carefully crafted public relations statements or smooth operational excuses. The moment the elevator doors opened, the lead investigator from Northbridge handed the vice president of operations a single sheet of paper. It was a legally binding directive, backed by the full weight of their massive financial contract. The demands were immediate and absolute. First, they required an instantaneous, system-wide administrative lock on all claim file editing permissions. No one in the entire building could approve, alter, or delete a single document. Second, they demanded a complete, uncorrupted backup of the primary servers. Third, they seized the master list of the priority contractor group. Finally, they demanded the raw, unfiltered login and authentication logs for the entire compliance department covering the previous 6 months. The physical transformation of the office was entirely cinematic. In exactly 10 minutes, the entire color and rhythm of the floor completely drained away. The background noise of 50 people aggressively typing and talking over their headsets vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. You could suddenly hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. The constant, forced laughter from the sales and coordination desks died instantly. Down the main corridor, the heavy glass doors of the executive conference rooms were slammed shut one after another. Through the glass walls, I saw Derek Holston. He was moving toward the stairwell. For the very first time since he had arrived to optimize our lives, the effortless, confident glide in his step was completely gone. He was walking too fast, his shoulders rigid, his expensive suit jacket flapping open. He looked visibly off balance, a man who had just stepped onto a stair that was no longer there. His perfectly rehearsed smile had been entirely erased, replaced by the pale, wide-eyed look of prey caught in the open. I remained at my desk, my hands resting lightly on my keyboard, watching the system lock me out of my active files. The screen flashed a stark red warning box, indicating a global freeze on all financial authorizations. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my elbow. It was Lila Voss. The director of human resources did not look perfectly polished today. Her breathing was shallow, and a thin layer of sweat broke through the expensive foundation on her forehead. She did not ask me to come to her office. She pulled me aggressively into a small, windowless supply closet located right next to the break room, shutting the heavy wooden door behind us. The air in the closet was stale and smelled sharply of printer toner. Lila leaned against the door, her chest heaving as if she had just sprinted up 3 flights of stairs. The sophisticated, legally vetted mask she always wore had completely shattered. "Why did you not tell me?" she demanded, her voice a choked, desperate whisper. She was practically shaking. "Why did you not warn us that you were going to take this outside the company?" "We could have handled this internally. We could have fixed it without triggering a massive external audit." I looked at her. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I looked at the woman who had tried to bury my professional reputation to secure her own financial future. I kept my posture completely relaxed and my voice entirely flat. "I told you 3 times," I replied, pronouncing every single word with deliberate, chilling clarity. "I brought you the access logs. I brought you the duplicate invoices. I told you my digital signature was being actively forged to steal disaster relief funds. You just told me it was not a priority." Lila closed her eyes, letting her head fall back against the heavy wooden door. She had absolutely nothing left to say. She knew the trap was completely sealed, and she knew she was locked inside it right alongside the man she had tried to protect. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the operational floor had been transformed into a highly restricted forensic crime scene. The investigators from Alder Klein did not mess around with group interviews or casual inquiries. They commandeered the 5 largest conference rooms and began pulling my team members in one by one. They were ruthless and incredibly efficient. They confiscated company-issued laptops the moment an employee walked into the room. The internal technology team, visibly sweating and flanked by the Northbridge legal representatives, was forced to pull the raw data directly from the server racks. The investigators were running side-by-side comparisons of the portable document format files, looking at the exact structural blueprints and material invoices I had flagged weeks ago. They utilized specialized forensic software to strip away the recent edits, restoring the exact file histories to reveal every deleted comment, every bypassed checkpoint, and every removed hold flag. The most terrifying part for the management team was the authentication trace. The auditors did not just look at whose name was stamped on the approval. They traced the specific hardware location of every single 2-factor authentication token used during the late-night approval surges. They were cross-referencing the digital requests with building access swipes and network router addresses. They were actively mapping the invisible web Derek had built in the dark. As the afternoon dragged on, the sheer scope of the disaster began to leak out of the conference rooms. A shocking piece of information rippled through the hushed cubicles. Derek had not just corrupted my specific queue. The investigators discovered that the infection had spread much further. 2 entirely different compliance teams, operating under different immediate supervisors, but answering to the same division head, had also been systematically forced to drop their verification steps for that exact same cluster of priority vendors. The ghost network was massive. It was not just a few $100,000 slipping through the cracks. It was a highly coordinated, multi-million-dollar pipeline designed to bleed the hurricane relief funds dry. Derek had built a machine, and he had used the intense pressure of the corporate restructuring to force everyone to feed it. The atmosphere on the executive floor above us turned actively toxic. What Lila Voss had desperately tried to frame as a simple, easily contained conflict between a difficult employee and a demanding manager had suddenly detonated. It had ballooned into a catastrophic, systemic fraud risk. The executives had spent the last 1 year desperately hiding every flaw, polishing the company to look perfect for the massive equity firm looking to buy them out. They had ignored the smoke because they wanted to cash their massive exit checks. Now, the fire was burning completely out of control, right in the middle of their air-conditioned sanctuary. The Northbridge representatives were already making phone calls to their federal regulatory compliance officers. The entire multi-million-dollar buyout, the golden parachute the executives had sacrificed all their ethics to secure, was suddenly on the verge of total, irreversible collapse. The executives were finally panicking, scrambling to find someone to blame, completely unaware that the person who had handed the matches to the auditors was sitting quietly at her desk, drinking her coffee, watching their entire artificial world burn to the ground. While the independent investigators were systematically dismantling the operational floor, seizing servers and locking down our digital terminals, the cornered animal finally bared its teeth. Derek Holston was a survivor of corporate restructuring. He fully understood that a forensic audit took several days to yield a formal, legally binding conclusion. That gave him a very narrow, desperate window of time to seize control of the narrative before the concrete evidence buried him completely. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my inbox pinged with a high-priority notification. It was a calendar invitation for an emergency disciplinary review, sent directly from the desk of Lila Voss. Attached to the meeting request was a newly generated performance evaluation. It had been drafted, approved, and filed in the system just 45 minutes prior. I opened the document and read it with a detached sense of clinical fascination. Derek had completely rewritten my entire professional history. It was a brilliantly vicious piece of corporate fiction. He had scored me in the lowest possible percentile across every single metric. He formally described me as an employee possessing an unhealthy obsession with archaic procedures. He explicitly accused me of intentionally causing catastrophic processing delays to protest the new management structure. Most dangerously, he added a lengthy paragraph claiming I had engaged in a persistent pattern of sabotaging team morale, painting me as a bitter, disgruntled worker seeking personal revenge against a highly successful manager. Human Resources was preparing the guillotine. They wanted to officially frame me as a toxic saboteur and terminate my employment for cause before the auditors could publish their preliminary findings. If they fired me first, they could dismiss all my claims as the wild, retaliatory lies of a disgruntled former employee. I walked into the Human Resources conference room at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. The air inside the room was incredibly heavy, thick with manufactured gravity. Lila sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her hands folded neatly over a fresh legal pad. Derek sat to her right. He was no longer pacing or sweating. He wore a mask of deep, paternal disappointment, looking at me as if I were a promising student who had tragically lost her way. I sat down directly across from them. I did not bring a notepad. I did not bring a union representative. I maintained a state of absolute, freezing calm. I knew exactly how this specific psychological game was played. If I raised my voice even a fraction of a decibel, I was unstable. If I defended myself passionately, I was belligerent. If I showed even a single ounce of fear or anger, I would give them the exact emotional reaction they needed to justify my immediate termination. "Mackenzie," Lila began, using her most patronizing, gentle tone, "we are here today because your recent behavioral patterns have become a severe operational liability for this division. Derek has documented a consistent, aggressive refusal to collaborate with the new workflow mandates. She is entirely paralyzing the pipeline," Derek added, shaking his head slowly, refusing to make direct eye contact with me. "I have tried repeatedly to coach her through these transitions. I have offered her multiple opportunities to adapt, but she is actively trying to destroy the new velocity model out of pure spite." I did not blink. I did not offer a defense regarding my processing speeds or my collaborative spirit. "You are currently holding a disciplinary hearing regarding my attitude, while 3 independent federal investigators are actively cloning our divisional servers right outside that door," I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any inflection. "That seems like an incredibly poor allocation of human resources." Lila narrowed her eyes, her polite facade cracking just a fraction. "The external audit is a routine compliance check triggered by the sheer volume of our recent payouts. It has absolutely nothing to do with your severe insubordination. We are here to discuss your termination." She was fully prepared to deliver the final blow, but before Lila could slide the official severance paperwork across the polished wood, the heavy door to the conference room swung open. It was not an investigator from Alder Klein. It was not a legal representative from Northbridge Assurance. It was Tessa Wynn. Tessa was Derek's coordination assistant. She was a quiet woman in her late 20s who spent her entire professional life blending seamlessly into the background. She was the person who ordered the catering for executive lunches, organized the digital calendars, and filed the travel expense reports. She was the absolute last person anyone in the building expected to interrupt a closed-door executive disciplinary session. Tessa did not look at Lila. She did not even glance in my direction. She stared directly at Derek, and her face was pale with a terrifying, purely selfish kind of rage. Tessa had not experienced a sudden, dramatic moral awakening. She had not developed a bleeding heart for the hurricane victims. She had simply been paying very close attention while the auditors tore the floor apart. While Derek was busy trying to frame me in the human resources system, Tessa had quietly snooped through the unsecured draft folder on his primary computer terminal. She had discovered his ultimate contingency plan. Derek had preemptively drafted a highly confidential internal memo, ready to be sent to the executive board the moment the fraud was officially uncovered. The memo blamed the entire security breach on his assistant. It claimed that a deeply confused and overwhelmed Tessa had mistakenly mishandled the two-factor authentication tokens and accidentally transferred the corrupted vendor files in the middle of the night without his knowledge. Derek was fully prepared to throw her directly to the federal authorities to save his own career. Tessa walked right past Lila and dropped a worn, spiral-bound notebook onto the center of the conference table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. I just handed a certified copy of this exact notebook to the lead investigator from Alder Klein, Tessa said. Her voice was shaking violently, but it rang out incredibly loud in the suffocating quiet of the room. It is a detailed, handwritten log of every single wire rush request you verbally ordered me to execute over the last 3 months. It includes the exact dollar amounts and the specific vendor routing numbers you made me push through the system. Derek's face completely lost its color. The mask of paternal disappointment vanished instantly, replaced by the stark, raw panic of a man watching the floor completely dissolve beneath his feet. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Tessa was not finished. She pulled her mobile phone out of her jacket pocket and slammed it face up onto the table right next to the notebook. I also gave the investigators high-resolution photographs of the encrypted text messages you sent to my personal phone. Tessa continued, her voice rising in pitch. The messages where you explicitly ordered me to log into the administrative portal and manually transfer the priority vendor files directly into Mackenzie's digital queue. The messages where you specifically demanded I make sure the transfers happened after 9 o'clock at night, so she would not be at her desk to see them. Lila stared at the notebook and the phone as if they were live, ticking explosives. The entire fabricated case against me evaporated in a matter of seconds. At that exact moment, Lila's mobile phone, which was resting near her legal pad, lit up with an urgent priority notification. The screen flashed brightly. It was a mass communication dispatch from the Northbridge Assurance Legal Division, sent directly to every member of the Iron Vale Executive Board. The subject line was entirely visible from where I sat. Northbridge was officially instituting an immediate, complete freeze on all financial payouts to the entire priority vendor group pending a federal fraud inquiry. The money was officially stopped. The pipeline was dead. The massive corporate buyout, the golden parachute the entire executive board had been desperately protecting by ignoring my warnings, was now completely and publicly jeopardized. The prospective buyers would run the moment they saw the word fraud attached to the main ledger. The silence in the conference room was absolute and devastating. I had not won the war yet, and Derek had not officially been escorted out of the building by security. The final, fatal blow had not yet been struck, but the fundamental dynamic of the entire company had just shifted forever. For the very first time since Derek Holston walked into our department promising speed and velocity, the narrative was no longer being controlled by the loudest person with the smoothest voice and the most expensive suit. The entire survival of the corporation now rested exclusively in the hands of the people holding the undeniable proof. The final reckoning arrived on a Monday afternoon, inside the largest executive boardroom located on the top floor of the building. The atmosphere inside the room was incredibly heavy, carrying the exact, suffocating weight of an impending criminal sentence. There was absolutely no casual chatter. Sitting around the massive, polished oak table were the chief executive officer of Iron Vale, the head of our internal legal department, 3 senior investigators from the Alder Klein Ethics Board, and two glaringly uncomfortable representatives from the massive equity firm that had been on the verge of purchasing our company. Derek Holston sat near the far end of the table. His expensive custom suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him, and his face was the color of wet ash. Lila Voss sat perfectly rigid across from him, staring blankly at her empty hands. I was seated quietly in the corner, a designated witness brought in to watch the absolute destruction of their careers. The lead investigator from Alder Klein stood up, dimmed the overhead lights, and projected the preliminary forensic report onto the massive wall screen. The numbers displayed were catastrophic. Over $2 million in disaster relief payments had been definitively flagged for severe irregularities and fraudulent authorization. The audit confirmed that dozens of structural repair files had been aggressively altered, completely bypassing the mandatory security checkpoints immediately after my colleagues or I had explicitly rejected them. Furthermore, the financial trace confirmed my initial hidden findings. A massive cluster of the priority vendors were entirely fake entities, routing their approved corporate checks through the exact same 2 intermediary bank accounts located right here in the city. But the investigators did not stop at the raw financial data. They moved directly into the internal conspiracy. The screen changed to display a recovered, highly classified draft document found deep within the personal server folder belonging to Derek. It was titled as a root cause operational memo. It was completely pre-written and ready to be distributed to the executive board of directors the moment any federal regulators noticed the missing money. In the memo, Derek explicitly pinned the entire multi-million-dollar fraud on a rogue, disgruntled compliance coordinator who was secretly logging into the system after hours to manipulate vendor files out of personal spite. The name typed at the bottom of his fabricated scapegoat document was mine. Before Derek could even attempt to open his mouth to offer a defense, the investigator switched the slide, shifting the crosshairs directly onto the Human Resources Department. The internal technology team had successfully recovered the deeply buried email archives detailing my initial warnings. The screen displayed the internal ticketing system for the entire room to read. It clearly showed that when I first reported the forged signatures, the automated system generated a severe warning ticket labeled as manager misconduct and fraud risk. Exactly 4 minutes later, the digital logs showed Lila Voss manually accessing the administrative dashboard and changing my complaint classification code to a minor, non-actionable category labeled as workflow tension. She had deliberately, maliciously buried a massive federal crime simply to keep the operational floor looking peaceful for the prospective buyers. The motives for both executives were then laid bare for the entire room to judge. Derek had recently signed an employment contract containing a massive performance clause. He was guaranteed a 6-figure cash bonus based entirely on the speed of monetary disbursements and the raw percentage of closed files. Completely regardless of their accuracy, Lila possessed an equally lucrative retention bonus. However, her specific contract explicitly stated that her payout would only be authorized if the corporate buyout closed with absolutely zero material compliance incidents on the record. They had both actively sold out the hurricane victims and actively tried to destroy my professional life just to protect their impending payouts. Then came the final, devastating blow. The lead investigator turned off the projector and looked directly at the chief executive officer. He announced that a deep background check into the 2 local bank accounts had revealed the ultimate destination of the stolen money. One of the largest priority vendors receiving the fraudulent payments had direct, hidden financial ties to an independent consulting firm. That consulting firm was legally registered to the brother of Derek Holston. The entire boardroom practically exploded in absolute silence. It was the kind of quiet that actively rings in your ears. The private equity representatives immediately closed their leather folios, their faces completely disgusted, silently signaling the immediate death of the multi-million-dollar buyout. The chief executive officer did not yell. He simply pointed a trembling finger at the heavy wooden door. 2 corporate security guards stepped into the room. Derek was ordered to surrender his building access badge, his corporate credit card, and his company-issued mobile phone right there on the polished oak table. He did not say a single word as the guards escorted him out of the room, completely stripped of his title, his reputation, and his freedom. Lila Voss did not wait for the guards to approach her chair. She quietly stood up, placed her silver fountain pen on the table, and announced her immediate resignation before the formal termination paperwork could even be printed. Iron Veil Recovery Partners was completely broken. To avoid immediate federal prosecution, the legal department was forced to draft a humiliating internal correction letter to the entire company. They were legally mandated to publicly reopen and audit every single file that had been dispersed during the entire hurricane season. When the room finally cleared of the disgraced executives and the furious investors, the head of the legal department asked me to stay behind. He slid a brand new, highly lucrative employment contract across the table. They were offering me a senior director position in the newly formed Independent Controls Office. It came with a massive salary increase and, most importantly, the absolute authority to report directly to the legal board, completely bypassing the operational management structure forever. I looked at the contract. I looked at the panicked, exhausted men sitting around the table who had allowed this culture of toxic speed to flourish in the first place. I did not cry. I did not give a long, passionate speech about justice or morality. I did not revel in the theatrical satisfaction of the revenge. I simply looked at the head of the legal department and asked one single, freezing cold question. Is this a priority now? He could not meet my eyes. He simply nodded, staring at the floor. I picked up the contract and walked out of the massive glass doors. I stepped into the elevator, leaving behind an entire corporate system that was finally forced to admit a terrifying truth. The person they had so easily dismissed, the quiet employee they had viewed as nothing more than a stubborn obstacle, was the absolute only person who had seen their massive building burning when the fire was still just a spark. Thank you all so much for listening to my story today. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments below, so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.